Hey, it's Noel from Creation Effects, and this is part 2 of an in-depth tutorial on the effects that come with Landscaper. If you just stumbled on this video, Landscaper is an After Effects template that lets you create really cool 3D landscape animations in Adobe After Effects. You can really make just about any type of landscape you can imagine with this. It comes with 1,000 landscape elements to build your scenes with. You can easily add water to your scene simply by drawing the body of water with your pen tool. The sky and lighting of the scene is all automatic, and you can set the time of day and the sun and moon and stars come out. You can create time-lapse animations simply by keyframing a single control, and it also comes with lots of effects that you can add to enhance your scene, like waterfalls, fog, 3D titles, rainbows, insects, birds, heat haze, and a lot more. So those are what I'll be explaining in this video, the included effects. And I've already gone over half of them in part 1 of this tutorial, and it turned out that there are just so many effects that the video is going to be too long. So I'm splitting it up into 2 videos, and I'll cover the rest of them in this video. If you're looking for a specific effect, you can just use the video chapters to jump to the right one. And if you're looking for the main tutorial for Landscaper, that's a different video, and I'll put a link in the description to that one. But let's get on with the effects. The next effect is lightning. The lightning effect lets you add random flashing light to your cloudy sky. You don't actually see lightning bolts with this effect, but After Effects has a couple different lightning effects built in that you can look at if you need lightning bolts. So this comp uses the HD layer, but there's a 4K layer here for 4K comps, and I'll play this back so you can see it. With the layer selected, you can see all these different masks, and I'll hit the M key to reveal those masks in the timeline. So 10 different masks, and these define the areas that light up. So you'll want to use this with a cloudy sky. So the first thing you would do is go to your sky pre-comp and choose one of these cloudy options, or bring in your own cloud image. Or there are a couple cloudy presets in the clouds effect comp here as well. And then once you have your clouds, you can move these masks to different areas that you want to light up. And you can adjust the shape of your masks so that they follow the edges and contours of the clouds. And if you don't need all these masks, you can delete some. Or if you want more masks, you just duplicate any of these as many times as you want. What you can't do is draw new masks with the pen tool, because they won't work. They don't have the expressions on them. If I reveal the mask opacity properties of these masks, and I'll scrub through the timeline and watch these values, you can see that they flicker on and off randomly from 0% to some other random value. And we can customize the timing of that flickering using the lightning controls up here. There are actually 2 levels of flickering that we can adjust. The mask opacity that we looked at, which turns the masks on and off, we can control those with these on time and off time controls. So these values are in seconds, and you can see we have minimum on time and maximum on time, as well as minimum off time and maximum off time. So the masks will turn on and off randomly within the boundaries that you set here. In addition to that, there is another level of really fast flickering, so that while any mask is on, the light will still flicker really fast until that mask is off, and then the light goes out completely. So you can adjust the speed of that really fast flickering with this flicker speed control. And then if you think your settings are good, but you want to try a new random order or timing of the flickering, you can just change this random seed control to any other value, and it will create new random results. And then below our customization controls, we have several effects here, which can light up the sky in different ways. And I'll make this really big so we can see what the effects are doing. I like using this glow effect because it finds the brightest areas of the clouds and then brightens them even more to the point where they glow. And this turbulent noise effect adds some texture and even more glow to it. So depending on how bright or dark your cloud image is, you may need to adjust the glow threshold here, or you don't have to use these at all. You can turn on one of these other effects to just brighten up the sky, whatever you think looks like lightning to you, or you could add some other effect if you wanted. But that's how this effect works, and to get it to your landscape comp, all you need to do is copy it and then paste it into your landscape. It's not a 3D layer, so don't put it in between a group of 3D layers that are all together. Probably the best place for it is at the bottom, below your furthest elements, so that the glow shows up behind them. All right, next we have Moon Shadow. I'll switch it on and off so you can see what it does. The moon that is part of every landscape has a bunch of customization controls on the main control layer. And one of the things you can do is adjust the phase. So you can make it a full moon or a half moon or a crescent moon. And it was a while after I had finished making the moon that I actually realized that I could see the stars right through the shadow side of the moon. And I couldn't believe that I missed it. Just because that part of the moon is not lit up by the sun doesn't mean it's not there, right? Anyway, out of curiosity, I Googled crescent moon and stars, and what I saw was illustration after illustration of crescent moons where you can see the stars right through them. Actually, it was really hard to find any illustration, even the more realistic ones, where you couldn't see stars through the moon. So I don't know if people just don't think of it, or maybe it's a creative decision that they make. I don't know. But to me, you'd have to be a horrible, terrible person to create this monstrosity. That's how my brain is. So I made this effect because it was impossible to do it on the moon layer itself. But here it's all set up so that you can just copy it to your landscape and it will jump right to your moon. And you can see it has this glow around it as well, because really, if you want it to be realistic, you don't usually see stars and a moon in the same area of the sky, because the moon is so bright it blows out the stars. Anyway, to get this to your landscape, copy the moon shadow layer, paste it to your landscape right underneath your moon layer. Then in the controls for your color, use the color picker to sample the color of your sky right around where the moon is. And you can adjust the amount of glow using the controls. And note that the outer glow is not made with any effect, but with a layer style down here. And the only other thing to note is if your sky changes color, like in a time lapse, you can always keyframe this color control to change over time to match your sky. Pollen is a simple one. There's 3 options here of floating pollen or dust particles, both HD and 4K versions. You can just composite these over your scene. These are made with the CC particle world effect, which is a great effect because it's 3D, meaning it's compatible with your camera layer. So, for example, if your camera is moving forward, it will move forward through the particles. That interaction with your camera only works if a layer is 2D. If you want to have particles behind your foreground elements, then you would need to make this layer 3D and then push it back into 3D space. But then the camera won't interact with it like that, which might not be a big deal. It's just something to keep in mind. So these 3 different pollen layers have different looking pollen because inside the CC particle world effect, in the particles section, they each use different particle types. I used the 3 types that I thought would look best, and you can adjust the quantity and speed and color in here. If you're familiar with particle effects at all, you know that particles are emitted from a particle producer, and you can adjust the size and position of that producer up here. The producer is about twice as big as the frame, and you can see it when you select the CC particle world effect and zoom out. So this should be big enough, but if you've animated your camera to move a long distance, you might actually expose the edge of the producer, and then that area just wouldn't have any particles. So if that happens, you can move the producer or make it bigger with the controls. One last thing about the controls, there's no wind direction control up here. So to change the direction that your particles are moving, you can open the effect, open physics, and then adjust these three properties. They have a range of -1 to +1. So X is left and right, up and down, forward and back. And a value of 0 on any of these would be motionless. And the only other thing left to show is getting them into your landscape. It's easy, just copy and paste it. And it's not a 3D layer, so put it somewhere above all of your 3D layers at the top. Moving on to the rainbow comp, let's turn these effects on one by one. That's always the best way to see how an effect is made. So to start, we have a shape layer. So it's vector based. You can scale it up and it will never lose resolution. And it has this black and white gradient created with this gradient fill. And then our first effect is colorama, which maps that grayscale gradient to a rainbow spectrum. Roughen edges, then softens the edges. These two linear wipes fade out the left and right sides. CC bend it lets you curve the rainbow. Fast box blur softens the whole thing. And transform lets you move, scale, rotate, or change the opacity. I think everything that you would want to edit is found up here in the controls, like the thickness, or you can cartoonify it. As for the colors, being colorblind, I really just see two colors here. I see a warm color and a cool color, like yellow and blue. But I assume all the colors are here because that's what Colorama does. But you could also go in here and move these little arrows around if you want to shift colors or widen any band of color. So you can customize your rainbow in here or in your landscape if you want. To get it in your landscape, all you need to do is copy and paste it. It's not a 3D layer, so it should go on top somewhere above all your 3D layers. Or if you want to have it behind an element like a tree, the best way to do that is to pre-compose this layer. So go to Layer, choose Pre-compose, do Move All Attributes into the new composition, and click OK. And now you can make this layer 3D. And then you'll need to copy the material options from some other element and paste that to your rainbow layer. And you can push it back behind your elements and scale it way up. And make sure the layer is with your other 3D layers. Reflections lets you reflect your middle ground elements in the water. So, quick review. If you put a 3D element below these three blue water layers, they would be background elements and they would show up behind the ground plane and they'll be reflected in your water automatically. If you put a 3D element above the water layers, it's a middle ground element or a foreground element, and it shows up on top of the ground plane. Those are not reflected in the water unless you add this reflections effect to the element. So let me show you how to do that. I've got this tree element here. It's above my water layers. Also, this is sitting level with the water right now. But if I try to move it down into the water, you can see it never passes through the water. So we'll fix that too. I'll go to my reflections comp, and this effect is going to require two copies of your element, a top layer that is above your water layers and a bottom layer that's below your water layers. I'll select this top layer, and in my Effect Controls panel, I'll copy these two items, the title control and then this linear wipe effect, copy those, and then back in your landscape, paste them to your element. If you've been watching this whole tutorial, you'll remember this effect from earlier, which crops off the bottom of an element at water level. So now we can lower our element and it looks like it's submerged in the water. So move it to where you want it before you go to the next step. If you wanted to rotate the element, you can maybe see rotating the layer doesn't work. Our crop line is now crooked. I'll undo that. And what you can do instead is just add a transform effect to this layer. Put it before the linear wipe effect, and then you can rotate it in the transform effect. All right, next we can make our bottom layer. So just duplicate your element. That's Control D or Command D, and then move that duplicated layer down so that it's right below the water reflection adjustments layer and above the water reflection layer. If you want to name it reflection or something, you can do that. And I'll go back to my reflections comp and I'll copy the effects from the bottom layer. We only need to copy these last three effects because remember, our element already has these first two. So we'll copy these and paste them to our bottom layer in our landscape. And in some cases, you might see that your reflection is getting cropped or cut off on one side. And if you see that, you should be able to fix that by increasing the grow bounds amount. So that's it. There's a few steps, but it's really easy. Be sure to add this effect to every element that shows up above the water, not just elements that are sticking out of the water, but elements that are behind your lake maybe, or add it to fog or butterflies flying over the water. Everything should have a reflection. And if you want to customize your reflections, like the blur and the displacement, you would do all of that in the water controls on the control layer. Let's look at scene lightness. This is similar to Haze. The difference is Haze tints an element a specific color according to their distance from the camera. This effect just brightens or darkens elements according to their distance from the camera. So a good example of this effect is this jungle animation where the elements get lighter the further they are from the camera. I actually made this effect because as I made this animation, I wasn't able to get the look I wanted using the haze. Or here's another example. The elements get darker the closer they are to the camera, like they're in shadow. So this effect is easy to apply. First, just go to the control layer up here and copy the scene lightness controls, and we'll paste them to the control layer in our landscape comp. Then we'll go back and all of these layers have the effect. So just select any of these plant layers and copy this color balance effect. And then in your landscape, just paste the effect to all of your elements, or just a group of elements that you want to be in shadow or in light. And then you can go to your scene lightness controls and customize the effects. Elements that are right next to your camera would have a lightness value of this amount. So -100 would be completely black and +100 would be completely white. And then you can set the lightness value for your furthest element as well with this max lightness control. If the furthest element that you want to affect is 20,000 pixels from the camera, you would just set this max distance value to 20,000 pixels. And then that element will be brightened this amount, or darkened that amount if you use a negative value. So it works a lot like Haze. Next, we have 3 shooting star options that you can add to your night sky. If you've ever seen a real shooting star, they're more like this one, really fast and small. But if you want something more cartoony, you can use the second one, which has a trail of particles. Or if you're doing end of the world stuff, you can use the asteroid, which uses 2 layers. You have to move up the timeline a bit to see the full effect. It takes a while for the asteroid's tail to form. So to put these in your landscape, you can just copy and paste. If you're using the asteroid, copy and paste both layers. And these are 3D layers, but since they're going to be behind all of your elements, you can just put them at the bottom, like right above your stars layer. Now you can see this layer is much bigger than our comp. This is a 4K layer, so you may need to scale it down, and you can position it in the sky however you want. And you can customize it using these controls. But I think I'll go over the controls back in our shooting star comp. I'll reveal the keyframes on this second shooting star layer. You can see up here, these are the controls that have keyframes. So there's the position, which has 3 dimensions, because CC Particle World is a 3D effect. So you can make it so that it flies toward us or away from us if you want. FYI, you won't be able to use the crosshair to position the start and end point of your shooting star. The position won't match the shooting star's position. So you'll have to just adjust these values and then move forward to see where that put your shooting star. And then this birth rate determines the production of particles. So when the shooting star forms and when it fades out or extinguishes. Keyframing this control is better than keyframing the layer's opacity, because this will make the head of the shooting star fade out first, and then the trail of particles will fade out shortly after. You can see with the keyframes it goes from 0 to 250, and then from 250 back to 0. And these other controls are pretty self-explanatory, I think. The one important thing that's not in the controls is the particle longevity property. So that's how long the particles in the trail last before they fade out. So it affects the length of the trail. And you can edit that down here in CC Particle World. And this value is in seconds. For the asteroid, these 2 layers have slightly different settings to give them different looks. If you adjust the position keyframes or birth rate keyframes on one of these, just copy those keyframes over to the other layer so that the asteroids stick together. And I mentioned that it takes a while for the trail to form because it moves so slow. You can see the keyframes go all the way to the 20-second mark. If you want to start your animation with a long tail, you can just drag these layers over like this. And here's a trick you can do. If you double-click the layer, we can see the motion path for that position control. So if these are linear keyframes, what you can do is Option Command click it. So on Windows, that would be Control and Alt. Hold those down and click it, and then these little handles show up, and you can use them to create a curved motion path for your shooting star. All right, snow. I feel kind of bad about putting this here because all it is the CC snowfall effect. It's the effect that comes with After Effects. I figured maybe some people don't know it exists, so I thought I'd put it here. I did work on some more complex snow effects, but they were just so slow, and in the end I thought this one looked good, and it's fast. So there's no controls for this. You can just customize it right inside the effect. There's a bunch of options in here. And also, if you wanted rain, you could add the CC rainfall effect as well. I didn't mess with rain effects at all because none of the elements are wet in the photos, so it didn't make sense to me. But anyway, the snow effect, you can just copy the HD layer or the 4K layer to your landscape comp. These aren't 3D layers, so they can go near the top, above all your 3D elements. Sun rays is the next effect. There's a couple of options here, out of frame and in frame, with HD and 4K versions of each. So in frame just means we can see where the rays are radiating from. So this could be a quick and easy sun that you could copy and paste to your landscape. The landscape already has a sun, of course. Sometimes though it can be hard to get good rays on the sun though. It depends on how big the sun is, really. Small suns make it hard to get rays. So this might be a way to get more intense rays on your sun if you wanted. And you can animate the rays to slowly change shape. You could also have sun rays coming from somewhere off frame. If I zoom out a bit and then select the sun rays controls, this little crosshair shows up. So this is the position of our light source, or our light position. And you can change the position using the light position control here, or just drag the crosshair around. If you go too far, it disappears. So to see what's happening, I'll scale this layer way down. And I'll unhide these effects one by one. So first I have this turbulent noise effect to create a texture. And then I extend the texture way out using the CC reptile effect, which makes the layer a lot bigger. And then I cut out this little window in our texture in the shape of our comp using these two CC light wipe effects. Next, the CC light rays creates the light rays. This effect needs light and dark pixels in order to make rays of light. So that's why we have the texture here. And you can move the light position to anywhere that has texture. So you saw earlier how if you move this too far outside the texture, the rays disappear. You can move the light position way out here, like if you wanted to have really parallel light rays. You would just need to expand the layer further out using the CC reptile effect to add some texture way out there. And actually, if your light position was like directly above this, you wouldn't even need the texture on these sides. So you could go in here and turn these sides down to 0, and it would make the effect a little bit faster. Every little bit helps when you've got so many layers and effects. I know that the render times on this template can get really long. And the next effect, this fractal noise effect, adds a texture on top of our rays, which can look kind of like dust or mist in the sun. And lastly, the photo filter adds color to the rays. And then to get the rays into your landscape, just copy and paste the layer. And these are 2D layers, so don't put them in between groups of 3D layers. You can usually just put it on top somewhere, like right above your sun effects layer here. If the light rays are too intense, you can always try a different blending mode for the layer, like screen. Alright, next up is the swarms comp. These are pre-rendered swarms of flying insects. We've got a few butterflies flying across the frame, a swarm of mosquitoes, and fireflies. These are all made with the swarms template from Creation Effects. With swarms, you can create custom 3D swarms of a variety of insects, and you can make them fly wherever you want, and the flight behavior of each species is automatic. So if you want to check that out, there's the URL for the swarms page in the instructions layer. Just copy and paste that. As for getting these clips into your landscape, it's just a simple copy and paste. These are 3D layers, so you can put them somewhere above your water layers, grouped with your other 3D elements. And you can move them forward or back to put them in front or behind certain elements, and then scale them so that the layer is just a little bit bigger than your frame. And make sure that you don't ever see the edges as your camera moves. The title effects comps has 21 3D titles that you can edit and then place in your landscape. They all have a 3D extrusion feature to give them depth, which I'll show you in a minute. These are taken from the Creation Title Effects template, which has 200 title effects, covering just about every theme you could think of. They're all just individual text layers, so you can just click on them with a text tool to edit the text, and then change the font to any font in your library. And then you can customize their look using the customization controls. So the URL for the Creation Title Effects page is in the instructions layer if you want to look at that template. The ones I included in this template, a bunch of them are nature themed, or just ones that I thought might look nice in a nature setting. You can just unhide the layers to find the one that you like. And these are a little different from Creation Title Effects. I made a few changes to these. So these are all pre-comp layers. So to edit the text, you just open the pre-comp by double-clicking the layer. Then you can use your text tool to edit the text to say whatever you want. And you can change the font size, letter spacing, whatever. And in the pre-comp is also where you can customize the look of the effects. So we've got our familiar slider controls up here that you can play with to get different looks. I'll go back to my title effects and let's take a closer look at this first title. All of these titles are fine. Most of them have some kind of theme like ice or grass. So they might not be as useful to you. So for most people, I think this first one is the most versatile and generic enough to work in any landscape. So I'll open the pre-comp. And this is one that's not complicated. It's got a basic gradient made with the circle effect. If you don't see the gradient, try changing the gradient offset control here. And you can choose your colors here. And what makes this title different is it uses a photo to make the texture. It's not just a photo overlaid on top of the texture. It's a lot better than that because it uses the texturize effect. So you can go to pixabay.com and download a texture photo, something that complements your landscape, and then you can replace it with this one. And I've already got a texture image here, and so the easiest way to swap it out is just select this texture layer in the timeline and then hold down the Alt button, or on a Mac, the Option button, and then drag the image from the project panel into your timeline. That swaps out the source of this layer. And remember to change the font. And I would make your text really big in this comp. Make it fill up the comp and get lots of detail, and then you can scale it down in your landscape. So once you're done customizing the text in this pre-comp, you can copy the title in the title effects comp, and then go to your landscape and paste it above your water layers so that it's with the other landscape elements. And I would recommend that you position it so that some of the title appears behind some foreground elements to make it look like it's in the landscape and not just composited on top of it. Maybe push it back a ways so that it picks up more of the haze color. And lastly, we can extrude this text if we want to make it three-dimensional. It's really easy. First, you just make sure that you're done customizing it and you have it positioned where you want it. Then just select a layer and duplicate it a bunch of times. The shortcut for that is Control-D or Command-D. 10 times is usually plenty, and then each copy will be automatically pushed back a little bit further in Z-space, creating a 3D extrusion. And now, if we go back to our original title layer, which would be the bottom one, you can use the 3D extrusion controls on that original layer to control all the duplicates. So you can increase the spread amount, and the extrusion gets longer and the layers spread out. If the extrusion isn't smooth and you can see the edges of the individual layers, try increasing this horizontal blur control just a tiny bit. That can help smooth out the extrusion without having to use a ton of copies of your title, because the more copies you make, the more it adds to the render time. And one other thing you might want to do is parent all the copies to the original title layer. So I'll select all the copies, and if you don't see the parent column, right click somewhere up on this top bar up here and choose parent and link. And then you can pick whip those layers to the original layer. And now you can move or rotate this original layer and the extrusion will stick with it. Waterfalls is a fun one. Who wouldn't want a waterfall in their landscape, right? There's 4 options here, 4 different sizes ranging from small to very tall. And each waterfall is made up of 3 layers, but you don't ever need to turn on these map layers. Just unhide the main waterfall layer and the surf layer to preview a waterfall. So just look at those, the different ones, and pick the one closest to what you want to use as your starting point. For this effect, you'll customize the waterfall in this pre-comp and then drag this whole pre-comp from the project panel into your landscape. So I'll show that in a minute. Let's look at this tall waterfall here. If you want to see how this was made, I recommend you hide all the effects and then unhide them one by one to see what they do. But basically, each waterfall is made of several components. So first we have a texture that moves downward, and then that gets cropped and it gets roughened using a turbulent displace effect. And you can see the turbulence moves downward with the texture. And then on top of the texture, there are falling water droplets made with the CC particle world effect. The goal is to also keep those moving downward at the same speed as the texture. And then we have another CC particle world effect to create side mist, and another CC particle world to create base mist. And the last component, I just added this as I was preparing for the tutorial. It's these rings of white surf that move outward. I'll talk more about this in a moment. As for these map layers, I'll unhide one of these. These help give the waterfalls more of a 3D quality using displacement. Because without displacement, the texture is just falling straight down at a constant speed, and it would just look really flat and boring. But we have 2 displacement map effects on here, one for vertical displacement and one for horizontal displacement. And those fix those problems. And they look at the gradient on their map layer to know which areas to displace. So the vertical displacement map effect here makes it so that a large top portion of the waterfall gets squeezed or condensed to a short little area. And that makes it look like the water is falling slower at first and then picking up pace. The other displacement map effect, the horizontal one, bends the top of the waterfall to the right or to the left so that it looks like we're looking at it from an angle and the water is shooting off the side of the cliff. All right, let's look at the customization controls. Those are on the main waterfall layer. You can see we have a section of controls for each individual component, the texture, the water droplets, the side mist, and the base mist. And up at the top are some general appearance controls that affect the overall look of the waterfall. The only component you can't control here is the surf, which you can just adjust on the surf layer itself, and I'll get to that. I'm not going to go over all these controls. You can just play with them. The most important ones are at the top, width and height. And I'll just warn you about one thing. If you need your waterfall to flow in the other direction, you can use the flow direction control, but that might make some particles move in the opposite direction. Like, I can't remember if it might just be on a couple of the waterfalls, but this side mist spray starts traveling upward instead of downward or something like that. So if you do see that, just put that flow direction back to where it was and just flip the entire waterfall by reversing the X scale of the layer. Or if you need more control over the direction that particles move, you can always just open up the CC Particle World effect and open the physics section and then gravity vector, and you can play with these properties. So play with these customization controls if you need to. Just be sure that your entire waterfall fits inside this comp. Like, you can turn up the wind and the mist will blow away in the wind, but make sure it doesn't go too far and get cut off at the sides. All right, the last component, these rings of surf. This clip is actually beach waves. It's one of the ocean surf clips used in the beach effect. So I have my layer rotated a little bit so you can see it. I have a shift channels effect that keys out the black background. Then this polar coordinates effect is what wraps it into a circle. And then a levels to brighten it up. And then this circle effect makes it much brighter in the center where the most surf would be. And then I just made it 3D and light it horizontal and positioned it at the bottom of the waterfall. So if you're customizing your waterfall and you make it wider or you move it, you may need to adjust this layer. There's no trick to it. You can just drag it into place, scale it if you need to. Okay, when you've got the waterfall looking the way that you want, you can bring it into your landscape. So find the waterfall comp in your project panel and then drag it into your landscape. And you can place it with your other 3D layers. Make the layer 3D, and you can see this looks awful. In this template, if you ever add a 3D layer to your landscape, unless it comes from the element library comp, you'll have to change some settings on the layer or it's going to look like this. And I show how to do that in the end of the main tutorial also, but the first thing I'll do is expand some other element, and I'll select the material options and then copy and paste those to my waterfall layer. Then I'll also grab the color correction effects from another element and I'll copy those over. So there's this tint effect for Haze and then a couple effects that work with auto sky. So I'll copy all those and paste them to the waterfall. These effects are optional. You may find that you don't like your waterfall to be tinted, so you can just turn these off if you want. So now the 3D layer is compatible with our landscape and we can position this in 3D space. If you're making it come over some element like a cliff, you would probably want to move it back to the same distance as that cliff, or maybe just a little bit in front of it. And you can scale this layer or stretch it if you need to make it fit better. You could add one of the distort effects if you want. I like the corner pin effect because it's simple. The corner pin effect is especially helpful if your waterfall is wider, because you can slant the top of the waterfall to make it line up with your cliff if needed. All right, we're on our last effect here, and that's wind. Wind can be added to your plants and it makes them sway or quiver. It's compatible with auto sky, so that if you keyframe the clock control to make a time lapse, the plants will move faster. There are a number of different kinds of plants in here, and I've adjusted the settings for each one. So you can just quickly copy and paste the effect for whichever kind of plant you need it for. A few things you should know. This effect will slow down your comp, especially when you have it on a lot of different elements. So just something to keep in mind. You can always disable all the wind effects in your landscape by going to the scene controls and on the control layer, and then unchecking this checkbox, turn on wind effects. So that will make your comp a little bit faster, and then when you're ready to render it, just turn it back on. And elements will bend and sway from the layer's anchor point. So make sure the layer's anchor point is at the base of the plant. You can use the pan behind tool to drag the anchor point to the base. Also, this effect is meant to be used on multiple elements that are grouped together. Like if we preview this row of grass here, obviously that doesn't look good. It's only going to look good if you've got multiple grass rows that are spread out on the z-axis and they're all shaking in different patterns. And by default, if you just copy the same settings to multiple elements, they're all going to sway together. So what you have to do is change the random seed, this first slider control. So change it to a different value on each element with a wind effect, and then they'll all shake differently. So this effect works well. It's as realistic as I can make it, but it is a bit hard to figure out, to customize it. So I'll try to explain what I did here. There are two main effects on here. There's CC slant, which just slants or skews the layer. And let's preview that. Okay, and then there's CC bend it, which actually bends or curves the layer. And those two effects work together in sync with each other. So the slanting happens first, and then the bending is linked to the slanting. So it copies the same movements as the slanting, but the bend is on a slight delay. So what that does is it makes the plant look flexible, because it looks like the base starts to move this way at first, and then the top of the plant gets pulled that way right afterward, and it sort of whips forward. At least that's what happens when it's working correctly and the settings are right. Also, you might have noticed that there's more detail in the bend movements. The bend is following those larger, slower movements of the slant, but it's also adding another level of smaller, quicker movements. So those small movements I called quiver, and the larger, slower movements I called sway. And you can see I've got controls for customizing both the sway and quiver separately. Both sway and quiver are made using wiggle expressions. I don't want to give too much information, but basically you can control the speed and amount of both wiggles. You've got frequency or speed, and then amplitude, which is the amount. So to put this simply, if you wanted to turn up the wind on an element, you could increase the sway amount. That will increase how much the element moves in the wind. It will increase how much it sways, but also how much it bends, because remember, the bend is linked to the sway. And right now the bend amount is set to 150% of whatever the sway amount is. So you could increase or decrease the bend amount with the control. So I just told you how to increase the amount or distance that the element moves in the wind, but if you want to increase the speed, like how fast it moves back and forth, then you would increase the sway speed here, or the quiver speed here, to add really fast, detailed shaking. And it gets more confusing. We have this bend delay here, so you could adjust the delay time before the bend follows the sway. So if you increase the sway speed, you would probably want to decrease the delay a little bit. This is at 0.2 of a second right now. If you decrease this, you make the bend happen quicker after the slant. Again, the goal is to have it sway first and then the top part follow through and bend over it. And then wind strength, this just adds a constant bend to the plant, like a sustained wind. And it'll bend toward whatever direction you have here for the wind direction. So either right or left. You only need to set the wind direction if you add wind strength, which is not at all necessary. None of this is really necessary. If the default movement looks okay to you, then just use that. Okay, so to copy this to your element, all you need to do is select all of these effects, everything but the key light, and then paste them to your element in your landscape comp. And don't forget to change the random seed for each element unless you want them to all move together. Okay, done and done. That's a weird expression. That's all the effects, and you are now experts in the Landscaper template. You can go make some awesome landscapes now. I hope you learned a lot. And if you like the template, please leave a review on the site. That helps me a lot. If you like After Effects and you like this template, there are a whole lot more at creationeffects.com. I've been making these things for a long time. The most recent is Creation Trippy Effects. It's full of psychedelic animations as well as trippy effects for your footage. There are a number of animal templates which would go well with this landscaper template because you could add animals to your scene. I have elephants, lions, horses, wolves, and panda bears. And as I mentioned earlier, there's the Critter Collection series, which includes flocks for making custom flocks of birds, swarms for custom swarms of insects, and schools for animating fish. There's also falling leaves and auroras. Ocean is a template with a different way to create realistic 3D bodies of water in After Effects. There's Infinite Horizon for creating perspective bending scenes. Micro, which lets you create realistic microscopic animations. Pixel Pusher lets you make abstract particle animations. Wisp allows you to make custom 3D trails of particles. There's Network for animating networks of lines and dots. There's a typewriter effect, a 3D flag effect, ink bleeds. The custom 3D storybook is probably the all-time most popular. There are old film effects, old VHS effects, digital glitch effects, title effects, and another crowd favorite, Creation Artifacts, which allows you to convert your footage into animated artwork in just about any medium.